On the night of September 19, 1961, Betty and Barney Hill were driving home to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, from a short vacation in Niagara Falls and Montreal, moving south along U.S. Route 3 through the White Mountains. Betty, an active member of her local church and a New Hampshire state welfare worker, had spent much of the early drive enjoying the moonlight reflecting off the valley and the surrounding mountains. Around 10:30 p.m., she noticed a bright light in the sky that seemed to track alongside their car, growing steadily larger and moving in ways that didn't match any airplane either of them recognized. Barney, increasingly unnerved as the light continued to pace them through Franconia Notch for the better part of an hour, eventually stopped the vehicle and stepped out with a pair of binoculars for a closer look. According to both of their later accounts, what he saw through those binoculars sent him running back to the car in a full panic. A large, silent craft with a row of humanoid figures visible through its windows, apparently watching him from above as the object began to descend. What happened in the minutes and hours that followed became the single most consequential gap in modern UFO history. The Hills arrived home significantly later than the drive should have taken, and neither of them could account for roughly 2 hours of the trip. Betty, within days, began experiencing recurring, deeply disturbing nightmares about being taken aboard a craft and examined by strange beings. Barney, who had never previously shown any interest in UFOs, developed severe anxiety, ulcers, and hypertension that his doctors couldn't otherwise explain. The couple kept the experience largely private for nearly 2 years, sharing it only with a few investigators and Betty's sister, fearing public ridicule, a fear that carried extra weight given that Betty and Barney were an interracial couple in early 1960s New England, at a time when that alone drew unwanted scrutiny without adding an alien abduction story on top of it. It wasn't until March of 1963, after finally discussing the sighting openly with members of their church, that a member of the congregation suggested they explore hypnosis to recover the missing 2 hours. They were eventually referred to Dr. Benjamin Simon, a highly respected Boston psychiatrist and neurologist who had built his reputation treating psychiatric trauma in military personnel during his years as chief of neuropsychiatry at a major army hospital. Beginning in January of 1964, Simon conducted weekly hypnotic regression sessions with the Hills for roughly 7 months, always hypnotizing them separately so that neither could hear or be influenced by the other's account, with every session recorded on tape. What emerged, slowly, was an extraordinarily detailed and, on the broad strokes, remarkably consistent story. Both Betty and Barney described being stopped by humanoid figures at what felt like a roadblock, taken aboard a craft, and subjected to physical examinations. Barney's account emphasized intense, almost hypnotic eye contact with the beings and a sense of non-verbal, telepathic communication. Betty's version was more elaborate still. She described needle-based examinations, a painful procedure involving her navel that she interpreted as a kind of pregnancy test, and an extended conversation with a being she called the leader, who showed her a 3-dimensional star map and briefly allowed her to look through what she described as a book. That star map became the single most famous piece of evidence associated with the case, and the one that has generated the most sustained, genuinely rigorous, independent scrutiny of anything in modern UFO history. Betty, still under hypnosis, described the map as a pattern of stars connected by both solid and dashed lines, which she was told represented regular trade routes and exploratory expeditions. She sketched the pattern from memory once she was fully awake. In the late 1960s, an amateur astronomer and schoolteacher named Marjorie Fish took the sketch seriously enough to spend years building a physical, 3-dimensional three-dimensional scale model of the actual stars in Earth's stellar neighborhood, methodically testing different viewing angles and star selections against Betty's drawing. In 1974, Fish presented her findings at a MUFON symposium from one specific vantage point, using only stars now confirmed to be sun-like and therefore theoretically capable of supporting a habitable planet. The pattern lined up with the real positions of a binary star system called Zeta Reticuli, located roughly 39 light-years from Earth, a system whose specific characteristics weren't confirmed by professional astronomers until years after Betty's original 1964 sketch. That timing detail is exactly what gives the star map its enduring power in believer circles. If Betty Hill's hypnotically recovered memory happened to encode real astronomical data about a specific, scientifically plausible star system before that data was publicly available to any hoaxer, it becomes considerably harder to explain the drawing as pure invention. Proponents of the case, including physicist and longtime ufologist Stanton Friedman, have argued that Fish's methodology was considerably more disciplined than casual pattern matching, pointing out that she deliberately restricted her search to stars close enough, old enough, and stable enough to plausibly host a habitable planet by the scientific standards of the day, rather than simply matching dots to any nearby stars, regardless of their properties. A constraint, they argue, that meaningfully narrows the odds of a coincidental fit. Skeptics have pushed back hard on multiple fronts regardless. Critics of Fish's methodology have pointed out that she tested many possible star combinations and viewing angles before settling on the one that fit, a process that risks finding a coincidental match in essentially any sufficiently large field of data points, the same statistical hazard that makes it possible to find recognizable shapes in random star charts generally, or faces in wood grain and clouds. Some astronomers have also disputed whether the Zeta Reticuli system's binary companion would realistically permit a stable, life-supporting orbit for a planet at all, undercutting the habitable system framing that made the match feel so significant in the first place. And critics have further noted that Betty's original sketch, drawn from memory after waking from hypnosis rather than sketched in real time under trance, introduces an additional layer of reconstruction and potential distortion between whatever she actually experienced and the final map Fish spent years analyzing. The single most important and most consistently underreported detail in the entire case involves Dr. Simon's own professional conclusion, the very psychiatrist whose hypnosis sessions produced the story in the first place. Simon was unambiguous, both at the time and in later interviews, that he did not believe the Hills had actually been physically abducted by extraterrestrials. What he did believe was that something genuinely traumatic and genuinely felt underpinned their shared distress. He simply located its origin in the Hills' own minds rather than in outer space. Simon's working theory centered on Betty's recurring nightmares, which had begun well before the hypnosis sessions and which closely mirrored the alien abduction imagery that would later emerge under trance. His hypothesis was that Barney, who insisted he'd never discussed Betty's specific dream content with her, may have unconsciously absorbed fragments of her dream narrative simply by overhearing her describe them to other people in the household. Betty's own niece has separately recalled overhearing her aunt on the phone, anxiously discussing the sighting in the period before the hypnosis began. Under that theory, the matching testimony that makes the case so compelling wouldn't represent two independent people recovering the same suppressed memory of a real event, but rather one partner's dream imagery, gradually, unconsciously, bleeding into the other's hypnotic recall, a well-documented psychological phenomenon rather than proof of shared extraterrestrial contact. Believers in the case have pushed back on Simon's framing in turn. They point out that Simon himself, despite his skepticism about the literal alien explanation, repeatedly affirmed that he found no evidence the Hills were lying or consciously fabricating their account. Whatever had happened to them, in his assessment, they sincerely believed it. Proponents have also argued that Simon's shared dream theory doesn't fully explain some of the more granular, independently corroborated physical details reported around the case, including a local report from an Air Force officer of unusual radar activity in the same region on the same night, and Betty's dress, which she said had been mysteriously stained and marked after the encounter, and which she preserved for decades, an item that would go on to be chemically analyzed by researchers decades later, though the resulting claims of unusual trace elements have never been independently replicated by a mainstream forensic laboratory and remain, at best, an intriguing but unconfirmed footnote championed primarily by researchers already sympathetic to the case. Skeptics have offered their own, more grounded competing explanation for the original sighting itself, independent of anything to do with the hypnosis sessions. A local aviation researcher named James McDonald examined the Hills' described route and proposed that the object they'd watched for over an hour may have been nothing more exotic than an aircraft warning beacon mounted on nearby Cannon Mountain, noting that the lights described behavior, appearing, disappearing, and seeming to track their movement along the winding mountain road, closely matched what a stationary beacon would look like to a driver whose viewing angle kept shifting as the road curved. Under this theory, the couple's later, more dramatic memories of a landed craft and humanoid encounter would have developed afterward, layered on top of a genuinely misidentified but entirely mundane light, compounded by exhaustion from a long overnight drive and the psychological stress load already documented in Barney's health at the time. There's also a stranger, less examined thread that has occasionally surfaced in later research, claims difficult to verify and disputed by most mainstream historians of the case, that Betty and Barney held sympathies toward the Soviet Union during the height of Cold War tensions, raised by at least one independent researcher in later interviews as a speculative possibility that Cold War-era counterintelligence interest, rather than genuine belief in aliens, may have shaped how the case was investigated or amplified at the time. The claim has never been substantiated with primary documentation and is treated by most researchers as an unproven curiosity rather than an established fact, but it illustrates just how many competing, half-provable theories have attached themselves to this case over more than 60 years. Skeptic Philip J. Klass, the same investigator who spent years building the hoax case against Travis Walton, also took an interest in the Hill case, and researchers combing through his personal archives have since uncovered correspondence suggesting a coordinated effort among some of the era's UFO skeptics to specifically characterize Betty Hill as psychologically unstable or delusional in the press, a campaign that, if accurately characterized, would represent its own quieter conspiracy running in the opposite direction. Not aliens covering up contact, but skeptics allegedly working to discredit a witness rather than simply engaging with the evidence on its merits. Barney Hill died in 1969 at just 46 years old, having spent the last years of his life still processing an experience he never publicly recanted, his health never fully recovering from the ulcers and hypertension that first drove the couple to seek psychiatric help in the first place. Betty became one of the most recognizable figures in American UFO research in the decades that followed, giving interviews and speaking at conferences until her own death in 2004, always maintaining firmly and without embellishment for effect that whatever had happened to her and her husband that September night was real. She continued to investigate other UFO reports around New England for years, developing a reputation among researchers as both a sincere and, at times, credulous investigator in her own right. The case became the direct template for John G. Fuller's best-selling 1966 book, The Interrupted Journey, later adapted into a 1975 television film titled The UFO Incident, starring James Earl Jones and Estelle Parsons, cementing missing time, hypnotic regression, star maps, and gray-skinned examining beings as the permanent architecture of the modern abduction narrative, a story structure that virtually every subsequent abduction claim, knowingly or not, has been built on top of ever since. So, which unsettles you more, that a well-respected psychiatrist, hired specifically to determine what really happened, spent 7 months listening to two independently hypnotized people describe strikingly similar events, and still concluded, in his own professional judgment, that it almost certainly wasn't real, or that decades later, an amateur astronomer with nothing but patience and a cardboard star model found a match to a real, scientifically plausible star system, using data about that system that hadn't even been discovered yet when Betty first drew the map.